Tonight we have Vicky Coin talking about nanotechnology. And we're lucky to have Kathy Murphy, who is here, one of our colleagues working on a National Science Foundation project. And she works in the area of nanotechnology at the University of South Carolina. And I have her introduce Vicky. But I also, right before that, I wanted to thank Montana EBSCOR for helping us fund this, and also the Montana Committee on the Humanities, who, without them funds, we wouldn't be able to do this.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction to the introduction. I'm pleased to present Vicky Coin tonight to you here at the University of Montana. I talked to Vicky just before to see a little bit of her history. So when people give science talk, we typically say kind of where they got their degrees from and who they trained with. So Vicky's from Baton Rouge, Louisiana originally. She went to college at Stanford, where she got a bachelor's degree in chemistry and physics, I guess. Maybe 2 degrees? 1 degree. 1 degree. 2 degrees at the same time. Where she actually did some undergraduate research in the area of porous silicon and surface chemistry and surface science thereof. She did her PhD at Berkeley in chemistry with Paul Alvisato. So those of us who know Nano know that he's one of the leaders in the field. And her dissertation research was on nanotechnological solutions to solar cells. So she did quantum dot solar cell work, which was very influential at the time. Following her graduation from Berkeley, she went to Bell Labs, where she was a postdoc and then a staff scientist, and she worked on holographic data storage there. So she's had a very well-rounded scientific experience. And then after Bell Labs, she came to Rice University, where she's been ever since. And her research has really blossomed in the area of nanomaterials and their impact on human health and the environment in many different ways, some of which we'll hear about tonight. So, Vicki, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to it.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. I think I need to turn on the microphone. I got some folks in the back here, right? So to keep them awake. Is it on? Good. Great. And I guess I'll keep the lights low. Oh, this is a little weird. Can we turn them up? I think I want the lights up. Is that possible in this room? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. It always is really fun to give lectures in the evening for people who are just interested in learning something new, and to get to share with you nanotechnology, in particular nanotechnology and the environment. And what I'll do tonight is talk about what that means and how it might impact you. And it's going to be some science, and I'm going to go through a couple of our projects, and then we're going to talk about implications issues related to can new technologies be managed in such a way that their risks are very low. That's kind of the hope I think we all have. Okay, so I'm representing a center at Rice University, a National Science Foundation funded center in biological and environmental nanotech. And as I go throughout the talk, I'll be speaking about various colleagues' work, and hopefully we'll be able to show you pictures and talk about who they are. But this is part of nanotechnologies. It's highly collaborative. Very little of the work I do anymore is done as kind of the sole professor. I don't do any work, my students do work, and they always do it in partnership with folks from other disciplines. And so that's one of the hallmarks of nanotechnology as a discipline in the academic world, is that it's really not in one area. It engages people from all over, and you'll see that in my talk today. Okay, if you have any questions, you can write this down. If you need a copy of the presentation, I usually post my things up on the web for a while. I don't like it to be, sold or distributed. There are copyright issues, I'm sure, with some of what I'm using. But if you want it for your own records, please feel free. Probably the Center for Ethics will have it, but if you want to contact me, go ahead. That's the best way to reach me with questions if you don't get them answered tonight. Okay, so let's start with nanotechnology and what it is. Would anybody like to offer a definition of nanotechnology? An impression if you don't have a definition. Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a small thing.
Oh, good. All right. Thank you very much for some interaction. That's exactly right. It's small. Okay. Anything else people might know about it? Yes?
Nanometer measurement.
That's right. It means on the nanoscale. And nano is actually, do you know what it's the Greek word for what? Does anybody know Greek? Nanos? Kathy doesn't count. Sure. It's a Greek. Actually, tell us, what is it? Dwarf. It's the Greek word for dwarf. So nano is all about small things on the 10 to the minus 9 scale. And before we get into a little bit more about that scale, let's talk about what they do. One of the features of nanotechnology is its breadth. So we'll talk today about nanomagnetic systems. And the thing you're looking at in the top is a transmission electron micrograph, so an electron beam imaging particles, which are the little dots, sitting on an amorphous carbon system. And that TEM picture is sort of the part and parcel of what we do as nanotechnologists. We take lots of pictures of things that are very small. And then we evaluate in this bottom example, which I'll talk about in today's talk, because those materials are the size they are and not bigger and not smaller, they have interactions with magnetic fields that actually provide utility in water treatment. This is an example from Naomi Hallis's lab at Rice University of a nanoshell. So think of a peanut M&M. You know, it's easy to do if you're hungry. And then imagine instead of the peanut, you have a piece of silica, a piece of window glass, and the candy-coated shell is gold. And in that system, you have very striking optical properties, particularly the ability to absorb near-infrared light. And Jennifer West in our bioengineering department at Rice University uses that capability to actually non-invasively cause cancer tumors to shrink, particularly those in the head and the neck region where you can't really operate. So this is an example of a nanoparticle being able to absorb light, cause something to heat up, and kill it. And that's just one of the many medical examples that I won't be talking about today, but are all over the place in nano right now. And finally, another example from the environmental arena of a nano gold, that you'll see the gold is the gold-colored atoms in this case. And on the surface are palladium atoms, which are islands. They're a little sort of deposited on top. And because of that, these materials are very good catalysts for removing chloromethane and other organics from water. So in all of these cases, you're using nanoscale materials to hopefully have unique properties and then solve problems. So what is nanotechnology? Well, it's actually a fairly simple definition that's really broad. It's really the concept that you're using these materials to actually solve some problem in the world, hence technology, in the title. And these are just the length scales we talked about. It's always good to calibrate people in length scales. And I could give you this idea that if you were, you know, a nanometer size, or if you were, what was the analogy? If you're holding nanometer basketballs in your hand, you know, 1 million of you would fit on the head of a pin, I think is one of the ones that I like. It's very hard to get a sense of this length scale, except that it's far below where your eye can see. And in fact is the domain of biology. So right here you sort of see a typical length scale. 1 millimeter we can see. If you get down to about 100 microns, those of you who are young can still see it. It's a little bit very fine hairs, or right around 100 microns. So as you go to the nanometer scale, you're orders of magnitude below that. So you're dealing with molecules, larger sets of molecules. A typical bond between two atoms in an organic system is about 0.14 nanometers. So that's too small to be nano. It's not just a single bond between atoms. You need tens of hundreds of atoms to come together to really define a nanomaterial. And that's a really critical idea in a lot of nanotechnology. So they're small, as we know. And this is another image, except now you're zoomed in about a factor of 10, so you're looking at a single particle. And one of the features that's very important in this particle, if you look at this image, what do you notice about it? Anybody want to tell me, if you look at this picture, what you see? Something just jump out at you? It's very regular, yeah, and that's in fact something we try to do when we engineer nanomaterials, is we try to position, these are actually columns of atoms. You're looking at a transparency in the electron microscope. And we don't just want a random collection of atoms inside of a particle. We need them to be aligned just like soldiers would standing at formation. We need to have a very crystalline and structured lattice. And that structure will be absolutely essential for the properties we're trying to take advantage of. Again, this is between molecules and lysozyme. I'm going to talk about the molecule C60 today, which is 60 carbons arranged in a soccer ball shape. And I just wanted to show it here. This is about a nanometer across. This system is 6 nanometers across, and this particular picture is a picture of lysozyme, a very important enzyme on the small side. So nanoparticles are on the size of a lot of biomolecules in your body that do important functions. So they're very, very tiny, but not down to the nuclear scale at all. They're still, you know, between the region of chemistry and biology as a length. So size does matter. Why do we work so hard to make something contain exactly, 60 atoms instead of thousands of atoms? And this is a quote. Does anybody remember this movie? This is becoming dated. Okay, so this is a great movie. We loved it in my lab. And remember who's Frank in the movie? It's a little dog. And Kay is like one of the guys. And so there's a very small dog. And in fact, this quote is great. What is with you humans in size? Just because something's important doesn't mean that it can't be very, very, very small. And then he gets this little tiny gun out and blows up a building. And the point was about the gun. And with nanotechnology, we work hard to make this size range, not just because stuff is small, and that means it can get into nooks and crevices and do stuff. It's actually because the materials have very unique properties. And a part of the definition we haven't talked about yet that I'm going to highlight again and and again in my talk, is that nanoparticles are great because they're very different. When you make something just the right size, you create materials that look nothing like molecules that chemists have been studying for hundreds of years, and you create materials that actually look nothing like big materials that we might study in mechanical engineering or use in other ways, things that we actually know. So when you make gold on the nanoscale, it doesn't look gold, and it can do chemistry that you would never imagine gold, an inert metal, to be able to do. And that really special feature is a very important concept in thinking about nanotechnology. And it's one of the reasons it's so different and so exciting. So I have an analogy for this, which I usually don't deliver well, but I will attempt it with this group. And so why does the size matter is a very interesting question, but this really tends to stick home with people. So I always get people to try to think about why small might be different, to understand how remarkable the properties are of materials when they get small enough. So the analogy I use, how many people in here are dog people? Really like dogs. Okay, and how many people in here are cat people? Okay, so here we go. All right, so my husband's a dog person. So, here's your average dog. Okay, everybody knows what a dog does, right? A dog is really happy when you get home, right? They love you. They're very dog-like. They're dirty. You have to take them out to the backyard. They're a lot of very different from cats. But they're really distinctive in their behavior, different species, different types. So if you took a dog and imagine you had a millimeter dog and you made it, smaller, if you could, you would still basically have a dog. Okay, there's another dog, a small dog. How many of you are really fond of small dogs? This is Montana, so I have this big dog concept here. Okay, so it's still basically a dog. You've got it smaller, it acts like a dog, happy when you get home, never arrogant, all of those things. Okay, now if you took that dog, say it was 100 microns. All right, so we're down at this range. Imagine a very small dog, and you made it 10 times or 100 times smaller down to a micron. But let's say you had to have the same dog mass. Well, if you shrunk the dog, but you needed it to weigh the same, what would happen? You would have a lot more dogs. Everybody get that idea? Same massive dog, just a lot smaller. So what would you have more of? You would now have like thousands of dogs. You'd have more dog hair because you have a lot more surface area. Everybody get that? Okay. The dog hair is very important. It comes up later in the talk. Okay, so if you shrink the dog down, you have to have more of them to have the same mass, and you have a lot more surface of dog. Okay, so you get this idea of big dog, small dog, maybe a little different, but basically a dog. And you go even further, which of course is not practical, but still a dog, lots more, starting to get surface area issues. Okay, what's really cool about nano is you go down and you start to access the 100 nanometer length scale. That's 10 times smaller than your micron-sized dog. And you get something totally different. Your dog is now a cat. It may be a very mean cat. I have a very angry and mean cat. And so my husband likes this analogy because it's quite apropos. And so this is a completely different animal. It doesn't even resemble, even though it might be constituted of the same material, it's just that size change, that factor of 10, boom, it's different. And that difference is what we look for as chemists because that gives us a new material with new properties. And so you have lots and lots of them. And they look nothing and behave nothing like the bulk material. And that dog to cat analogy, which I, maybe came across okay, is an important one because it captures, in some ways, the essence of what we're trying to engineer in these systems, is a really different change in the behavior. And it's not unexpected. We can predict, based on our understanding of the material, about the size that transition will happen. And not only that, as you then continue to make it smaller, the properties change as a function of size in ways that are very interesting. And that's really the heart of what you're trying to do in nanotechnology, is use those materials that have that different behavior that comes about strictly because of their size, not the material that's inside of them. So does anybody know what this is? It's a scanning electron micrograph. It looks a little different. See the scale bar down at the bottom? Somebody up front want to say for the people in the back?
500 nanometers.
500 nanometers. Anybody want to take a guess about what that is? People in my lecture today would have earlier might know. Not allowed. What do you think you're looking at? Okay, so think like a microscopist. What do you see in the image? Cylinders, good. You're starting to describe the objects. Rods. Are they rods? Are they square or round? Roundish. You think they're fragile? Maybe one of them looks a little curved. What else do you see in the picture? Flakes, these little tiny things, yeah. There's clearly actually two different components in the thing you're looking at. And by definition, you'll know the formal national definition now of nanotech says under 100 nanometers in one dimension is one of the thresholds, and in fact these are, if you measure them. Certainly this little fluffy stuff is. Anybody have any clue what this is? Okay, here it is. See if I can get it. Oh, there we go. Is a product you may use if you use sunscreens, if you use a lot of cosmetics now, especially foundations for women, and antiperspirants. All contain nanoscale materials in them that actually serve some very important functions, some of which benefits you, the consumer. This particular sunscreen protects you from UVA radiation, which is a particular type of radiation from the sun that's hard to protect any other way. And it protects you because these little particles absorb the light in ways that small molecules can't do. And what's really cool about it is they don't scatter light. Does anybody here remember the sunscreens that were white? Okay, that was because the particles were really, really big. They were in the dog range, and they didn't look very pretty, and, so they scattered light. These particles are so small that light does not interact with them in a scattering sense. It can't bounce off the particles, but it can get absorbed by them. The energy can go in and get converted to other kinds of things. And what that does is protect your skin from UV radiation, which is a known health hazard in the connection to skin cancer. So you probably use products every day that contain nanomaterials in them, and you will see them occur more and more. Now, sometimes they don't benefit you. Sometimes, well, they do indirectly. They let the people making the product sell your product cheaper. Because a lot of times if you use a nanomaterial, you don't have to use as much as the big material. But they're very prevalent, and there's been some very interesting studies about how they're used. Now, we're not all that excited about nanotechnology because of sunscreen, actually. What we really want to see is products that go way beyond these sorts of consumer products. The government, your government, the US government that's invested $1 billion in this area on average every year, is doing it for the future applications. And these are some of the science fiction-y things you might have heard of. This is a picture from MIT's Center for the Soldier, an Army-funded research center that's trying to make smart clothing. On the simplest scale, these would be particles that would be embedded in clothing so you would never ever have to wash them. That'd be cool, right? I don't know if there's any college students here, but that can be really important. And I would do that because they would degrade bacteria and other odor-causing elements on a sort of routine way. You could even imagine 30 or 40 years later, these suits would be integrated with power and could actually interact with you in ways that help you understand and navigate your environment better. And all of those technologies are based underlying on nanotechnologies that use some of these material properties that we'll talk about. Of course, this is Star Trek, one of my favorite shows, even in reruns. And this is a doctor with a little tube. And of course, nanobots are very big in Star Trek. They go and seek out disease and kill it all. And that's exactly the kinds of things people are working on in nanomedicine. And then, of course, this picture, which I love because the late Rick Smalley at Rice University, who's a Nobel laureate in chemistry, loved the concept of building an elevator to space, first put forth by Arthur Clarke. And in fact, carbon nanostructures, tubes of carbon, are in principle strong enough to make this happen. So these are very science fiction-y. I don't know if that would happen quickly, but they're all the kinds of things that drive this field forward and get people excited about it. Okay, so what I'm going to do today then, and the rest of the talk, is I've given you kind of, I hope, a brief introduction to nanotech and what it's about, what we're trying to achieve, is I really want to focus in on the environment because that's what the whole Center for Ethics here thinks about and what the program is really focused on. And so the center that I'm at has a lot of different things going on in environment. And we're going to talk about two sides of the environment. First off are technologies that clean it up, good ways of using these materials to do stuff. And then the other thing I'm going to do is talk about the dark side of nanotechnology. And I like to end with this because I think as a citizen, anybody, one of the challenges with new technologies is understanding and deciding if you actually want the technology. And if you want the technology, what risk are you willing to assume? And how should that risk be conveyed to you? Because this technology does not come without risk. No technology does. And some of those risks are environmental in nature. And I will talk about some of the science behind this, but hopefully have some time for discussion at the end. Okay, I'm still learning. Oh, there's a picture. I'm big on pictures, so great. Right, so when you're setting out to solve problems, you want to pick really hard problems, and I think all scientists try to figure out how their science can really impact the world. And so at Rice and a lot of the faculty involved with the center really focused on one big problem in water. So this is sort of the globe, a lot of big global issues. One of the issues is water. And if anybody's done any studies or thought about it, it's actually number 3 on the list of global problems now, behind energy and I think population control. The other thing that we work on is, of course, detecting and treating disease. And I'm not going to talk about that in this particular talk. We're going to focus on some water examples. And being a big western state here in Montana, I think you probably think about water, correct? Or do you have oodles of it? No, water, big deal? Okay. So it impacts your life. Maybe don't take it completely for granted. Although the true fact is that most of the biggest water debates come in the developing world, where there really is significant health consequences for the lack of water. So a lot of our research focus is there. Okay, so let's talk about, I'm going to skip that, one example from our center. And this is an example from Mike Wong's research group. Mike is a young chemical engineer who really, and I picked the example because he works with gold. And people know what gold is, and they know it doesn't react. And I'm basically going to go through with you as an example of how nanoparticles can be used to solve a particular problem and why. And this is the graphic schematic we'll talk more about. So one of the coolest things about nanoparticles is that surface area issue. So what you're looking at are particles of gold that, if you can count, those little balls are the gold atoms. These particles have more than 100 atoms in them, but they're still nano, a couple of nanometers across, and they're decorated with palladium, another metal. But they're still have a lot of affinity for one another. And what they're able to do, because they have such high surface areas, if you have a gram of this material in your hand, it would probably have the surface area, of about most of this building. Okay? And what that means is, if these surfaces are reactive, if they can track waste and actually convert the waste to something else, they are very, very effective at treating and removing bad stuff from water. So there's 2 things going on, the surface areas and the reactivity of what's there. So the particular problem we're interested in is trichloroethylene, or any chlorinated solvent, and I will bet you it's an issue in Montana because it's often associated with the mining industry. And one of the facts about most chlorinated hydrocarbons is kind of interesting. They get generated in a variety of different industries, and they're very, very miscible with water, which means they mix well with water. But they're also very, very toxic. They have big impacts if you drink them. They've been linked to cancer and other more acute disease. And what happens is they get embedded into aquifers, and they're incredibly difficult. You have to basically pump a well completely dry, and then you have to try to treat its water and pump it back. And what you're doing when you treat the water usually is you're using activated carbon and just removing the TCE or other chlorinated systems, and then you're left with a ton of activated carbon to go put in a landfill somewhere. You always have the TCE, the bad stuff around. It never gets converted to something else, but it does get removed. So what you can do with nanotechnology is you can generate these very small particles, and these are mixtures of these gold palladium systems. And you can, this is a size distribution of them, so they're about 4 nanometers, and they have just a little bit of palladium. It's like a spice that you put in there. For weight fraction is very, very tiny. And what these particles are able to do is those palladium sites actually react with the carbon-chlorine bonds present in the contaminants and convert them to basically just totally benign organic molecules and HCl, which is a very easily handled form of chlorine in the environment. And so they have these huge surface areas, which gives them lots of activity, and they have this reactivity. And so what you're able to do with that, so that's the picture, is what Mike did is he tuned the palladium concentration. This is a typical catalytic efficiency. How efficient is the particle? Particle doesn't degrade. Once it's done, it gets back to do more chemistry. It's a catalyst. He found that a very particular amount of palladium worked. If you had too much palladium, it was dead as a doornail. And if you had just the right amount, it was super efficient. And that's because these islands have to be very well defined. All of the chemistry is occurring right at these atoms at the corners that are not surrounded by many others. They're chemically active, but they're very well situated so they are not too reactive that they go away. So this is what they typically look like. They're clear solutions. And this is now the system that he tested at Rice. I thought I'd give you some examples of how you take these little tiny systems and you begin to treat problems with them. What these are giant tanks of sand that simulate a contaminated aquifer that might be associated with a dry cleaning site, a metal finishing site. And they've been doped with TCE, and there's sampling containers here. And what's happening is water's getting pumped out, and these are the columns that the water goes through, and then it goes back in. It's a very efficient process. by which you can remove the chlorine by interacting it with these particles. So it is a pump and treat system, but you actually completely remove the chlorine at the end of the day, or the chlorine gets converted to really nice forms of chlorine. So one of the things you do when you're a nanotechnologist, this is pretty amazing that somebody went from the lab of taking these transmission electron micrographs and very scholarly amount of work and actually went out and tried to find, okay, how do we scale it up even more? Because this is still in the laboratory. And so you need to find somebody with a TCE problem, and luckily there's a lot of those. We actually found somebody with a chloroform problem. So the first thing we did in the scale-up process is we had to, so this is just an example of what a site might actually look like. And this reactor was actually built for a site in California, a Superfund site, in which they were using commercial catalysts to try to treat chlorinated solvents that were really contaminating actually a local drinking water area. They actually had to completely lop it off and truck in drinking water. This system was developed by Martin Reinhardt at Stanford University, who's a collaborator with Mike Wong, and it cost about $500,000 to just make this pilot scale reactor, but you can see it's not that incredibly complicated, and it's a very effective way of treating these systems. The problem is they weren't using a nanotechnology based catalyst, so when they ran this system it wasn't efficient enough. They had to run it really slow. And then the water was dripping very slowly through those columns, and it was really too slow to be a practical solution for the amount of water that they needed to flow through the system. So the catalysts that were developed because of these little nano gold particles are actually very efficient, which means you can run water through at about the pressure of a fire hydrant. And that starts to be a feasible solution for some of these wells. So the well they actually found, I don't know if this is public, but here you go. It's not in Montana. So it turns out a lot of industries have problems with spills. And this is actually a site of DuPont. And they have a big problem. They had a very large chloroform release, which means one of their pipes carrying chloroform at one of their manufacturing plants near the Ohio River. An unfortunate fact is if you're a chemistry company and you're using these chlorinated solvents, you typically site near water because that's how you get your supplies in and out. So if you do have a spill, it ends up going into something like the Ohio River. And if you look at these numbers, what these are well samplings of chloroform all over. And they've actually been doing it as a function of time. I don't have the time-dependent data, but this plume started here. And it's unfortunately, they were kind of hoping it would move this way, they told us, but it's really moving right towards the river. Not quite there yet, but it's a big deal. They calculated it would take them over 5 years and I don't know how many thousands of tons of activated carbon to treat this thing. And then they'd have a bunch of activated carbon they'd have to go dump somewhere. So what we've agreed to do, and Mike is working on now, is that facility, that little tiny thing you saw on the last, is actually portable, and we're going to be siting it starting off right around here to treat a number of these wells, and then they'll be moving it over here and evaluating it as a treatment for this system. And that's one example of if you're doing nanotechnology, you try very hard to push your materials all the way through to find a problem it can solve. If this works and we can demonstrate it in the sort of pilot sense, then I think we'll see a lot more use of this technology. But it's one example of what it's like to push a technology out. You have to find people willing to try it out who have the right kinds of problems that can then from there be a further kind of testing. So that's one example from these chlorinated organics. Now, chlorinated organics actually are a simpler problem than the next one I'm going to talk about because they can be decomposed to materials that are non-toxic. You have a much, much different case on your hands, and I think around it is certainly here you have similar problems with other heavy metals and arsenic, which is what I'll be talking about. So arsenic and heavy metal removal generally is a very, very important problem worldwide, particularly both in the States as well as in areas of Southeast Asia. And arsenic, and the reason it's so critical is that arsenic is an incredibly difficult molecule to remove from water. It has the characteristics that are actually just make it it doesn't interact with activated carbon, doesn't interact with a lot of other materials we would use to clean up water. So if you ran it through one of those pure water filters, does anybody use those? Yeah, we do. Admire. You have one on your faucet. Those are activated carbon filters, and they do not interact with heavy metals at all. So they'll pull out a lot of the organic stuff from your water, but on heavy metal removal, they do very badly. And so heavy metals and arsenic in general fall into these categories of needing additional treatment. And unfortunately, I'm not an alchemist, so I can't convert arsenic to something else. It's going to be arsenic. It's going to go in a landfill somewhere. If somebody has a way to use it, that would be great. But right now, it's just bad news. And heavy metals, luckily, reclaiming them has some advantage. But the biggest tragedy is that for reasons that are more natural than industrial, the really hardest hit places are some of the poorest areas in the world. So you can actually treat arsenic poisoning before it gets to these points, but you have to have access to adequate medical facilities. And so much of the developing world, that's not happening. And the World Health Organization has made arsenic poisoning one of the big problems to try to address in the next 5 years. So it is a real tragedy. It's also a tragedy in the US. We have it a lot. I bet you have it here in Montana, but I didn't have time to check. If you have volcanic soils and you're up high in the mountains, you probably have arsenic issues. Depends a little bit on the geology. Arsenic comes from the natural soil. It's often bound to iron-containing minerals. What happens is when groundwater changes its pH, which can be due to natural reasons or man-made reasons, just a couple of minor changes in the pH conditions, it'll get released and become bioavailable. There's a huge interest in its removal. Most municipal water treatment plants cannot actually remove it. So the new EPA standards, which have dropped to 10 parts per billion, and they dropped to 10 parts per billion because of the epidemiology. If you study these communities that are located near these big red dots in the northeast, which people have, that's part of what this paper is about, the incidence, particularly of bladder cancer, is substantially higher. It's one of the clearest epidemiological links between the presence of a contaminant and cancer that is known. So in point of fact, a lot of people have argued for 5 parts per billion because it would save X many more lives per year, and it's simply a question of the cost of the technology, because we don't have it to get down to these very low levels. So people in these areas often buy bottled water or really are looking at other solutions. In Texas, where I'm from, you'll see in a second, it's also an issue. Okay, so existing adsorbents for arsenic removal. This is a quote from a well-known environmental science and technology paper, and it's been borne out by a lot of reports. None of the existing technologies work. So it's a great opportunity for people who work in nanotechnology, for example, to try to fix the problem using these small particles with weird properties. So these are some of the existing systems. We evaluate them a variety of ways I won't go into, but the most important one is how much waste do you have to dump every year. If you've got this magic sponge that's pulling arsenic out of your water, you don't want to have to get rid of bags of stuff every month. And that's going to come, as you're going to see in a second, from the surface area. That's going to really help a lot in this problem. Okay, so the things we're going to use go back to that point I might have mentioned that iron-containing minerals often associate with arsenic. And that fact was one that caught our attention because one of the things my lab does is make a lot of nanocrystals, a lot of these nanoparticles myself, or my students and my very talented postdocs. And so what you're looking at here is a typical sample. These are ones we might make in my lab. So this is a commercial material that people make of magnetite, iron oxide, lodestone. And you can see a lot of different sizes, kind of all agglomerated. Our syntheses that we do, the chemistry is a bit better. They're separated. They're more the same size. But nevertheless, we hypothesized these systems would be very good magnets for arsenic. And magnets are not the magnetic form, it's a chemical interaction. And so what this data shows you, I'm not going to go into it, is both forms of arsenic actually absorb to the surfaces of our materials at very high levels. What this means practically is that a gram of arsenic in my hand can treat the water that a family of 4 would use for about a year. And that's strictly due to the surface area, assuming kind of standard arsenic loadings. And that kind of absorption capacity is a very powerful number because it means you can start to use these nanomaterials and not have to dispose of as much waste. You've concentrated the arsenic down very effectively. At the end of the day, the things you throw away are 10 weight% arsenic, which is a lot. Some interesting chemistry here, and this is my graphic. I didn't do this graphic. A wonderful graphics artist did it. But these are the arsenic particles, and they give you a sense. You'll notice the hair on the surface are molecules that we have to attach to the materials to keep them in water. One of the features of very nanoscale materials is that you might think that they would fall under gravity, right? But they're so tiny that the buoyancy of them in solution keeps them from sedimenting. So one of the challenges is these things are really great at sticking arsenic. They become coated. In fact, multi-layer coatings of iron arsenates develop. But the problem is, how do you get them out? And they're so tiny that you can't use filtration. It's not a very effective technology. You need a lot of pressure. That's not going to work, especially if you're aiming for low power settings. So my students and I were really interested in using magnetic systems and the magnetic properties of the nanoparticles. So just like a fridge magnet sticks to your fridge, in principle, if you put a magnetic field on a solution of these materials, you should be able to pull out the material without the use of a filter. All you need was a magnet. It sounds great. It gets over the small particles are difficult to remove, and it really makes a separation system that doesn't need a power source, which is something we were really aiming for because of the people who need it the most. Here's a problem with the idea. I have one equation in today's talk. It's shown right here. You can look away if you don't want to see it. I'm not going to go over it, unfortunately. But what this equation describes is a force you need to place on a magnetic particle to get it to move. If you remember Star Trek, everybody remember the tractor beam? This is tractor beam. This is what it is. Okay, this is probably, if there was any basis for a tractor beam, this is the basis. Magnetic force acting on something to move it. Okay, and the problem with this equation, here's the magnetic field. Here's how magnetic your particle is. Everybody see V sub p? That's the volume of the particle, how much volume it is. Okay, so if you have a big particle, you have a lot of volume, and the force is really big. So if you shrink your particle down, what's going to happen to your force? It's going to go down. And in fact, it's going to go down more than the fact you don't need as much force to move a small particle. So what happens in principle, this very interesting sort of physics here, is that if you did use magnetic water treatment, to try to remove bad material, it would look something like this. This is an enormous electromagnet that they're using to remove magnetic particles from a wastewater treatment plant in Japan. The problem is this magnet is like several Tesla, which is like an MRI magnet, okay? And that's not going to happen in somebody's house, certainly not in Bangladesh, okay? So fridge magnet out the door, big giant magnet needed to move these little tiny things. It's kind of a funny equation, this equation. So we were kind of bummed out by that, and once I grasped that, I'm like, oh darn, okay. But then the students who were coming to me, this is kind of a funny story about graduate students, this is what their reaction looked like, and this is a magnetic stir bar. We use it to make our solutions spin around. And one of the things I always ask is, how do you know the brown stuff is magnetite? Fe3O4, the right chemical structure, the atoms are really structured. And usually you have to do X-ray diffraction, which is a time-consuming experiment. Students avoid it. I always have to say, go do your X-ray diffraction. And they're like, no, really, it's what we think it is. And I always make them do it. So, and then finally they fessed up. They said, well, we know the reactions that work because they interact with the stir bar. And I was like, well, what do you mean they interact with? Well, we see it clear out. They get attracted to the stir bar, and then we know the reaction worked. And I was like, but they're not supposed to move in a magnetic field, right? We need this big Tesla thing, and these are little tiny bar magnets. So we started to scratch our heads about what the heck was going on. We thought they might be aggregated, as they probably are in this picture. We tried out a lot of stuff. And so what we discovered, actually, was that that equation is right. But if you go back to it, everybody see this funny symbol called chi? That's the magnetic susceptibility. It's how good of a magnet something is. That turns out to be 3 orders of magnitude larger in a nanoscale system. So even though its volume has dropped, we've gained in the magnetic susceptibility a lot. And that meant that this equation, which was actually everybody kind of hadn't actually tested on the nanoscale yet, was not correct. It was correct, but we were applying it wrong. And so what we were able to do is to show that magnetic particles, this is now a red suspension that is a lot more stable, can interact. In this case, it's with a magnetic system that's designed, it's a permanent magnet, and you can see them depositing on the back here. And what that means now is we can remove these particles from solution. There's some brilliant size dependence to this that I don't have time to talk about. And that means that we can begin to think about applying them in settings where you might only have a permanent magnet. Does anybody know where somebody in Bangladesh or India would get a permanent magnet? Anybody, any idea? The ground? Yes?
I think sometimes here in the States anyway, farmers sometimes use them to remove iron particles from their animals.
That's right, you can use it that way. So people have strong magnets around, but do you know where they recover them from now and they resell them? Where is the strongest permanent magnet that you own? Stereo? Close, but not quite.
Television too.
Scooter TV.
Keep going.
Engine and the scooter.
Not the, I don't know about the car. I haven't evaluated that. But there's a gigantic permanent magnet that you own. It is in your computer. It is actually not the thing that reads your hard disk, but it's the thing that makes it spin. What keeps it spinning at like 5,000 RPM or something is an enormous hard drive magnet. And in India, one of the big, does anybody know what one of the cottage industries is in the developing world right now? We're shipping them our junk garbage, and they go and reclaim elements. And so permanent magnets are pretty easy to come by. And in fact, they're being resold on the market there. So, and they're really, really cheap. And those magnets are plenty enough to do this. You could use something like a fridge magnet, but it would just be very, very slow. There's a time dependence here. So in thinking through this problem, this meant we could do separations using very simple systems. So we got the stuff that sticks, bad stuff. We have a way of pulling it out that's very easy, separating it from water very effectively. And that gives us much, much higher efficiencies and numbers that begin to be reasonable, okay, from just like a US laboratory perspective for this problem. Okay, so one of the challenges, though, is our stuff, because if we were to treat all of the arsenic-laced water in the world, we would need more than 100,000 tons of this material. So if it's really going to be viable, this is how we make it now, okay? We have to think about how to do that. And this is an interesting story about chemistry that I'm going to just tell briefly. And this again gets into translation of science from sort of what you do in a lab to sort of the real world. So my student Jafar, who's really been the chemist on this project, is able to make a lot of different nanoparticles out of these kinds of reactions. And in fact, did some really nice work showing you could scale it up. We can make 20 grams. That's not enough if you really want to have an impact. And what we also realized was actually a very interesting principle that I was taught by some folks I got to know in international development, which is that the last thing in the world you want to do if you're targeting a technology for the developing world is to have it be manufactured here. In fact, what you want to do is get partners in the developing world very quickly to make it themselves. And in fact, the simpler and easier and the most appropriate way that's possible, the best. So my student Jafar, who is from Turkey, had a really interesting idea. What he realized was that the core constituents of this reaction are iron oxides, which we dissolve in something called oleic acid. And that dissolution process makes soluble iron. And at a high enough temperature, it falls apart, and the iron starts to find oxygens and form an iron oxide lattice. And so what Jafar said is that, hey, I can use oleic acid, and oleic acid is actually one of the components of the triglycerides found in olive oil. Can't use olive oil neat for some interesting reasons, but if you convert it to a soap that you then acidify, and this is all with very simple stuff, you can actually have one of our key solvents for this process. The other really interesting thing Jafar realized is he looked up some articles on what is rust. And rust is actually exactly the starting product we were using. It's an iron oxyhydroxide. And if you put these two things together and you heat it up, and I am not joking, he does this in a frying pan with olive oil. It does smoke. It goes past the smoke point, but it doesn't explode or anything. The temperatures we need are comparable to frying oil temperatures. You can produce magnetic nanoparticles that you can then remove with a bar magnet if you've done the reaction right. So the cost levels are approaching the cost of dirt, which is still expensive for the developing world, but it actually could be the basis for a micro business, where you would have somebody who might specialize in producing the materials, who would then create a small business out there. You might be surprised, but if you've been tracking the latest Nobel Peace Prize and other activities about international development, empowering local economies to adapt technologies for their settings that are interesting. Since we've done this work, one of the big questions has been, do we have to use olive oil? We don't have it. Turns out coconut oil is what they use in India. And the reaction works well with coconut oil. It's a slightly different type of monounsaturated fatty acid, but it works. So this is an interesting direction. The chemistry is fun, and it gives you pretty good, it's beyond green. This is what we call appropriate technology, technology we think could be adapted and applied in the developing world. Okay, and those are the kinds of questions you have to think about if you really want to get nanotech out there. So the particles are not quite as monodispersed, and they're a little bigger because that's actually what you would want for this. And these are the costs associated with that. We are now really moving into testbed work where we're finding sites that want to apply it. In some cases, this is from Managua in Nicaragua, which has a serious arsenic problem that they really can't deal with. This is one of their local water treatment pumping sites, and a lot of our stuff could be employed there as a column format, similar to the other example. The other partner that we have is actually Clorox, which makes Brita water filters, and is looking at using some of these systems in a very scaled down version for the household systems. Whether that would be the thing we employ in the developing world, I don't know. But all of these things are examples of some of the challenges that academic scientists face, again, as you start to translate this out. Okay, what I want to do now in closing is talk about the dark side of nanotechnology. I know that, the two examples I gave, and I tried to pick two things and go a little bit more in depth, are just two examples of many that I could have chosen about ways that people are trying to use these materials to solve problems and some of the challenges that we face as we begin to translate those technologies and really get them out of the laboratory. So one of the interesting problems that really is a big one, it's a huge roadblock, is what's going to happen to the environment if we use these materials and if we have them in our bodies, in our cars, in our water treatment systems. What's the impact going to be on the environment? And that's a really interesting question from a scientific perspective and a relevant question from a social perspective. So this is a very interesting slide, and it introduces a terminology that we developed at the center to talk about the trajectory of technology, in that it usually begins solving some really hard problem, sometimes an environmental problem. And what happens is some decades later, there's something that people learn about it, and they're like, uh-oh, you can't use that stuff. And it just shuts down the technology completely. It just stops it. In the case of GMOs, it went from being a very successful and one of the biggest investment opportunities of the mid-90s to being a functionally non-existent industry for some time, although that is now turning around. In other cases, it just went away as an industry. People would not accept it, would not use it, didn't want to have anything to do with it. And one of the things we realized is that although there are a lot of reasons this happens, perhaps if people had investigated early enough the impact of these systems, they could have found ways to either manage their risk or at least communicate the risk more effectively. Maybe before people used several billions of tons of the materials all over the world. So we reasoned that our systems, of course, being chemical systems, could fall prey to the same kind of trajectory, and that would make it very difficult to make a good accounting of the risk benefits, and that we should consider what we call the dark side of nanotechnology. And the other stuff is the Tinkerbell. That's the good side. So the kinds of things that we and others worried about fall into three different categories. The first, who's read Prey, the book? You should. It's not a bad book. I like Michael Crichton, and I'm in the minority among many people. So this book is about swarms of man-eating nanobots that take over the world, nefarious. And that's a concern, sort of the, oh my gosh, we're creating a new form of life concern. And that concern is one, as a scientist, I'm not going to deal with, because I cannot make said nanobot in my laboratory and evaluate if it wants to eat human flesh. So it's an interesting concept, but it's not one I can handle for me. I don't think you should not think about it as a risk, but it's just not something that I see that I can handle. And then the other one, of course, is, and that's this gray goo idea. The middle one is nanopollution, which is something I can evaluate, and we'll talk about that. And the third one you may not have thought of, but I've become more sensitized to it as I've tried to do tech transfer to the developing world, and that is the concerns about social justice. Who's going to own the new technology? Is it going to be fairly distributed? Are we going to think about, the developing world's perception? And my solution to that, not that it's a great solution, is to tech transfer early and let them adapt as they see fit, and not create a profit institution from the beginning, but instead transfer and partner from, we hope, the very first step. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this, although I've done a lot more in my own laboratory response to that. But I do want to talk about the pollution, because it is an interesting scientific story. And to tell the story, I want to start by saying nanoparticles are everywhere in your environment. So this volcano produces multi-ton quantities of carbon soot, much of which is nanoscale carbon, which we're going to talk about in a second. The other place you'll find nanoparticles is in a lot of factories. This is a picture of people waxing skis. The reason I picked it is there was something called ski waxers disease in the 1990s, which ended up killing a couple of ski waxers. All of a sudden, a lot of ski waxers got sick, a pulmonary problem. Some of them died, not all, but they got very sick. And the reason was that the waxes used on the skis that were sold, turned out by one company, had changed. And that meant when they applied the waxes, a fume of polymer, nanoscale polymers, were generated, inhaled, and in fact did grave damage in the lungs. And so those ski waxer diseases and others like coal miner's disease, silicosis, asbestosis are diseases of particles in the lungs. And so this kind of information, well, they're naturally occurring, and I think we all know that just because something's naturally occurring doesn't mean that it's safe. But it does mean that at least maybe biological organisms would have learned to interact with nanoscale particles. They're not entirely new objects. But the sort of unintended particles that are generated were another issue. The deal is that the systems that we engineer are much more pure than the systems here. And so we have a different question before us. So the two examples I'm going to give you is I'm not going to go back to the iron oxide or the gold. We're going to move on to another nanosystem. And these are the family of carbons. C60, the soccer ball, or a single-walled nanotube, those tubes. And these systems are extremely interesting for a lot of reasons. They're heavily studied because they're so fascinating. And I'm not going to go into details except to say that we're going to talk a lot about the soccer ball. And the thing to know about the soccer ball is it's a black powder. You might think it's like activated carbon, except it's the most hydrophobic substance in the world. What hydrophobic means is it does not dissolve in water, end of story. Not water dissolvable, very, very low solubilities in water. So we started out studying C60 because we thought it would be really boring in water. We figured we'd dump it in the environment, believe me, not a real environment, contained in the laboratory, and it would just not do anything at all. And in fact, this was a model we had. This here is a C60 face cream. If you want to go buy a face cream, you can buy it. There's a couple different companies that sell it. It's a little gray, which is sort of disconcerting. But it's thought to be very good for your skin for unknown reasons. But you can purchase it. It's one of the few commercial products of C60 right now, although I think we'll see a lot more in the next couple years. So the idea is it's going to enter the environment because it's going to get washed off of people, thrown away. In some way, it's going to make it into the aquatic system. We're pretty much limit our questions to aquatic, not so much to air, just because you got to simplify a little bit. Once it's there, it could stick to dirt. It could get eaten by organisms. Organisms could try to use the carbon to do stuff. Or it could actually do some sort of chemistry. And so we look at all of these factors, but I want to talk really about the organism part of this. So one of the first things that we discovered is that it's not boring. So if you take the black powders and you add them to water and you let them sit, they form clear yellow suspensions. So what's interesting is that there is a chemistry that occurs by which this soccer ball changes just a little bit. It aggregates with other soccer balls, but not to make big stuff, but actually nanoscale stuff. And these aggregates exist in water at very low concentrations, parts per million. And we're going to come back to that. So chemists had known this for a long time and thought it wasn't very important, because if you want to put C60 in water, parts per million is not enough to really care about. Okay, so what we did is we started to take that solution and just put it in biological systems to see what would happen. My lab does a lot more cell culture, so this is cell culture data, which means we grow cells in culture, not an animal. And we looked at the dose-response curve to figure out, okay, how much stuff kills the cells. And so, we increase the concentration, you see kind of an S-curve develop. And what you see is if you drop a line down at 50% dead, you get the LC50 of those cells, and these are the numbers we typically got. So that's going to be 50 to 2 parts per billion. And in fact, NHA or astrocytes, those are brain cells that are really finicky, not surprisingly more sensitive to this chemical agent than others. The thing about these LC50s is they're some of the lowest known of any molecular system. They're really, really, really low LC50s, which means the materials are cytotoxic or toxic to cells. Doesn't mean they'll be toxic to us, but it means that something was going on so that this sort of aggregate of this C60 was able to very effectively shut cells down and kill them. We did this similar experiments. This is actually now with Pedro Alvarez and Joe Hughes, who were looking at the impact on biological systems like bacteria. And these are lots of nanoparticles, and again, in those simple cellular systems, very, very active, meaning they're really, really good antimicrobial agents. Why this matters is if they're deposited and they wipe out a soil ecosystem of microbes, you really have some very grave ramifications for plants that are trying to grow. So understanding the microbial ecology of these systems is important, and it's very simple. They kill everything. So there really isn't any microbial ecology to speak of. A very uniform and non-specific kind of toxicity, in fact, valuable for some aspects of water treatment that we're looking at, but not so valuable if it's not contained. Moving up the system, zebrafish are another very good model for aquatic systems. This is some data looking at developmental toxicity, where you were exposing embryos and looking at how they develop, and a very high percentage of basically a lung inflammation. And what's interesting and a clue to the mechanism is if you add something called glutathione, which is an antioxidant, you suppress the effects of these C60 on aquatic organisms. And that suggests that what's happening is somehow the C60 is oxidizing or interacting with living systems through that mechanism. There's a lot of work that we had done on these systems, and I don't have time to go through the mechanisms, but basically here's the bottom line. These molecules are very fascinating systems. In their pristine form, like I said, they don't go into water. At least we didn't think. And you would think that something that isn't water soluble would hurt an organism, because what are people? Does anybody know what percent water we are? 80, right? So if something's not soluble in water, you'd think it can't really have any impact on me. And I was naive when I started this, and I thought that. And my environmental engineering colleagues sort of, they corrected me, because they said, well, you know, the worst contaminants out there aren't soluble in water. And I said, what do you mean? They said they're the molecules that are pretty insoluble, but they go into water just a little tiny bit. And I'm like, yeah, so there's barely a dose. But it's well known that when that happens and they interact with you, so you're mostly water, but they really don't want to be in water. They want to be in oil. So if they make it into your body, where do they go? To the fat. And your fat, well, if you're me, it's a lot of your body. If you're maybe you, it's not. But they deposit in your fat, and they stay there. And they do chemistry, and they do bad stuff. And if they deposit in the fat of lower organisms in the food chain, you eat that fat, and it concentrates. It's the pathway for bioaccumulants. And so, in fact, these very sparingly soluble organic molecules are the worst ones out there because they're fat soluble. So they get just enough into water, but they're very diluted. But then they get concentrated, and in fact, they tend to get concentrated in cell membranes, which are some of the most delicate aspects of a biological system. They're the barrier between cells and the external world. And they just really have a very high concentration. So if you look at this series, these are molecular structures of C60. We decided to test this hypothesis, and we took the C60, and does everybody see what I'm doing here? You're changing the structure. You're adding new carbon bonds on top of it. And these carbons, you see the oxygens in them? They're more polar. They make it more hydrophilic. So this substance really doesn't go much into water, partially soluble. The one down here with all the OHs on it, that is extremely soluble in water. Really, really, like orders of magnitude more soluble. So we still have the structure of C60, the ball, but we've altered the hydrophilicity. It's a much different kind of chemistry. And we also make it less reactive. So we tested this. Okay, what happens? Well, when you do that, this really toxic substance turns into a substance that up to like a huge concentrations has no impact on cells and no impact on zebrafish, at least in the acute toxicity studies that we're running. And it's a very interesting concept because it means that if there was some way, unfortunately, the best application of C60 out there is in polymer fuel cells to power laptop computers. So does everybody, who here has a laptop? Everybody's, right? You know what's in the battery of your laptop? Anybody know? Cadmium, nickel, just read it. Really bad stuff. What? Yeah, just, I don't know how, yeah. And generally, they're not things you want running around the environment. They're well-known hazards, okay? And they're heavy, and they, you know, all sorts of problems. A polymer fuel cell membrane, be very light. Guess how it would run off of? You would give it water, and it would power your computer, and then you would give it more water, and it would power your computer. So it would be great, right? It wouldn't, and it would be made of all plastics, you know, you wouldn't have any heavy metals in there. Except C60 turns out to be a great substance because it makes the efficiency of that system really good. It's one of the best target commercial applications for C60. So what we did is we realized if you could use it in this form without all the stuff on the outside, but you could chemically transform it to the non-toxic state, maybe before you had to get rid of the fuel cell, that might be a good idea. So one of the things that we realized is that you really have to ask the questions, not are engineered nanoparticles dangerous, but how can you engineer them safely? Are there ways? There may not be ways for all nanoparticles, but in this case, at least this acute toxicity we can mitigate. And in fact, one of the partners we have on this project now is we actually went to the corporation Mitsubishi, who's got all the intellectual property now on the fuel cells based on C60, and are working with them to have treatment schemes in the packaging of fuel cells so you could actually oxidize the carbon systems before they're disposed of, which would be a relatively simple thing to do. And once they're oxidized and they're in those fully hydroxylated states, you don't get them back up without doing something strange. So you're beginning the degradation process of the material. Okay, so that's kind of the good news. This is a good news story about how you can understand the chemistry and the mechanisms of toxicity to try to sort of bring it into the design process earlier. And it's one example that maybe will work out. But the bad news is that right now, the regulatory structure that we're operating under in the globe right now is not very responsive to concerns about nanoparticles. So to go way back to the talk about dogs and cats and materials are different when they're nano, this is a material safety data sheet for C60. It's what you receive in the laboratory if you wish to use it. And if you read it carefully, it gives you a bunch of information. But everybody read here, subacute to chronic toxicity. What does it say? Anybody want to read it?
nuisance dust.
Right.
It's irritating to the
Eyes. Okay, so it's maybe bad stuff, but it's elemental carbon / carbon black. So the basis of our regulatory system is that is it a new chemical? Who thinks C60 is a new chemical? Okay, EPA doesn't think that because it's made of carbon, and they know what carbon is, and so it's not new. It requires no new federal regulatory oversight because its composition, carbon, remains the same. It's a concept they're developing into what they call molecular identity, in that size of a material will not be a concern for the regulatory process. And what that means is these materials in your sunscreen, the materials that are used in antibacterial coatings, the silver particles, all are going to be regulated based on, hey, they contain silver. Well, silver is not very dangerous, so this stuff isn't either. So there's no additional regulatory oversight that will be required. So that's one thing that's true right now in the government. And I believe that at first we thought they would be rewriting these sorts of policies, and it seems like they're entrenching them. The other issue that I think all of us concern ourselves with is the fact that the exposure, what you get, the effect of nanotechnology will be related to how much you come in contact with, or your environment, or your grandchildren's environment has in it. And one of the things we realize is that our exposure pathways are very diverse. I hate to say it, but the sort of canaries in the coal mine are my graduate students. They're the ones who handle the highest concentrations of these materials on a regular basis, although for most of them a short period of their life. We, in those cases, usually have very good, we're a chemical lab, we know how to handle the materials, we use hoods, we do whatever we would for hazardous chemicals. But you'll notice this graduate student is, not wearing gloves. He would if he's handling an organic solvent, but it's unclear whether those gloves would protect him from nanoparticles because of the small size, or whether or not nanoparticles can become airborne and interact through an airborne route. So the exposure routes here are very diverse. And so the questions of risk are very diverse. It's not just one population or one time in the future. It can be many. So it's a very complex set of questions, and maybe a moot point if the regulatory process remains as it is, which is that it considers only composition as a factor and not also the structure and the size of the material. So ultimately, what we want, and this is unfortunately the reality that you all as consumers will face probably for the next 10 years, and this is a car following a tanker truck saying the scientific community is divided. Some say this stuff is dangerous and some say it isn't. And so the reality is this is a very young set of questions. We're working out how best to do these experiments, and there's unlikely to be like a complete and utter scientific consensus on whether nanoparticles generally are bad. Okay, each particle type will have its own story. And so as consumers, you're in a very normal situation of not necessarily having a clear message from the scientific establishment about what to do, but a controversial message, kind of both sides of the story. And that's a very normal place to be. And one of the things that I think all of us in the scientific community are trying to do is to work together to get the most important information out there quickly so people can begin to at least understand and make informed decisions about their own choice of use of materials. So I've given you a sense of some of the things that nanoparticles can do that are good for the environment and some of the challenges in actually translating these technologies into the real world. And we've talked very briefly, I gave you one story about the carbon systems, about what you need to do to help understand the hazard, the exposure, and then together the risk of these systems. So I know that was a lot, but you guys more or less stayed awake, even in the back, so I thank you for that. And with that, I hope that we can all come to a very balanced decision about nanotechnology that is one that takes into account the very complex and many uncertain issues that we face. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Questions?
I was wondering, how do you dispose of C60 in the lab?
Pardon?
How do you dispose of C60 in the lab?
Our lab takes great pains. We put it in the hazardous waste container. Any of the rinses or the materials that we use, and that hazardous waste container, most of them get incinerated and then put into a landfill. That's the standard method of disposal for hazardous materials.
And are other labs also doing that, or some?
Unknown. I think most chemistry laboratories are pretty aware that you don't throw bad stuff down the drain. And that you're kind of drilled into you, and there are these big waste dumps, and you just put everything in there. But I don't know that everybody follows that. I think that it would be a bigger issue, for example, for a company that might be using it as a powder, because in a powder form, its ability to get around is larger. But no, I don't know that there's no mandated waste disposal, because it is, if it was carbon black, we could, it's your pencil lead. And so it's not in principle something you have to be careful about.
I'm perplexed, as you are, I think. The idea of nanoparticles is that you take a substance and you work it at that level, you get really different things and different properties. The EPA is saying it's the same stuff. How did they get there?
So this is a really hard question for a lot of us active in this area. Because, EPA is the biggest funder right now for people to evaluate these issues. So you're scratching your head a little bit. Why are they, but, just because it's one government agency doesn't mean the research arm is talking to the policy arm. I think that the logic goes something like this. We've always regulated based on chemical composition. That is the heart of thinking about chemical substances. So they start there. Then they say, there's no real way to characterize or know if you have a nanoparticle. It's a hard thing to know. So they recognize that's a challenge. And then it's basically, and we know that the nanoparticles are replacing compounds that are much more hazardous, which are known hazards. So we're just going to say it's molecular identity, because if we open up size as a parameter, we just don't know what to do. That's kind of the logic. And then they cite, a couple, they're exploring the logic more or less. But I think the answer is that if you let size in as something to be a parameter, it actually calls into question, for example, how they might regulate polymers, and has other ramifications for them that they don't want to go into. So I'm really mystified, because they had an option in the particular regulatory framework they're dealing with, the Toxic Substances Control Act. Companies have to notify them if they're using materials that fall under TSCA. And then the companies are asked, what's the chemical composition? Well, okay, it's carbon. Well, in principle, it's okay. You can use tons of stuff, and we don't, no regulation is required. And so the companies are coming to them and saying, we are now using large quantities of these materials beyond research scale. And in principle, they could say it's a new chemical, which is a whole bunch of testing, enormous quantities, okay? That's like the extreme decision. But they had this middle of the road decision, which is called the Significant New Use Rule, or the SNUR rule, which rules that it's not actually different, but it's being used in a different way. And that gives the EPA great latitude to define the toxicological testing they would require. And all of us just assume they would SNUR like everything, because that's like the nice middle of the road, lets them decide. And what has just come out, and this is actually going up for public comment in September, is that they just said, hey, molecular identity, that's all we care about. And we're like, whoa, that's like way over here in the decision making. So it's really difficult. And I think, their argument that, well, it's really hard to know the size is like, okay, that's true, but that doesn't make it the basis for a regulatory policy. So I think it's, I have my own interpretations about what might be going on, which somebody could ask me about maybe, but they're just, I don't know what's in EPA's mind. I can't characterize it. I just can report to you the sort of summary capsule of their latest statement.
Follow-up question over here.
Yeah, how long is that public comment period going to be open?
It is currently open. It opened in early August, and it is going through, I'm a participant in the panel in September. So if you guys want to weigh in or write your congressman and say, we think EPA is bad, or needs to rethink it.
It's evident from your speech that you scientists are really concerned to use nanotechnology to remove arsenic from water, especially in the developing world, like India, Bangladesh. But the machine you just shown in the slide, it's really big and it's expensive. And as far as I could understand, I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, that it needs to be installed in a central pumping station where water is purified, right? But the arsenic problem, as far as I know, it's in India, it's in the villages.
Yes.
And most of the villages in India don't have tap water. They use waters from well or from tube wells or from ponds.
The famous tube well.
No, this system would be applied that way. So the design that I showed you was for a larger, what we call a developing world city, which probably has a rudimentary municipal water system. But the magnetic systems that we're envisioning could be potentially household systems. So one of the ways of water treatment that's in action there is, they can use sari cloths, or they can run it through something very simple over time. Something of that scale is exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to design. The challenge is there's no way I can design it. I can say it's got to be cheap, the materials have to be readily available, and they need hard drive magnets. And here's roughly what it's got to look like. And then I, having that information, find the scientist in India who can then go into the villages and begin to try to see what do the villagers come up with that works for them. Because it's really clear what your point is, the setting is everything, and what's going to work in India is not going to work in a Nicaraguan village. And so what I think that the concept, I don't know if we'll get this working, in tech transfer to the developing world, is you get it to the developing world as early as possible. And I didn't go into this, but one of the things that we're doing is to actually use, because surprisingly enough, this is true for the scientists in some villages, we're beginning to use an open source model where we're trying to display and give information about this olive oil system, or coconut oil. And in fact, our collaborator in India has already done it with Indian sources, to develop their own recipes for producing the materials and to adapt it to their local situation. So you're exactly right. The problem of arsenic actually occurs in villages because it sticks at high elevation usually, and those are usually well-based systems. It's possible a small system could get installed, but then there has to be a financial incentive for somebody to maintain it. So whether it would go household level, we're not sure, but we're thinking small businesses might be able to do this. There's a really interesting example that is a company we've hooked up with in India in which people do UV water treatment by riding bicycles and having battery-operated UV lamps. And they go to villages and install themselves for a couple of days and UV treat, especially the surface waters, depends on the part of India. And even if people are really poor, if they know that it's going to protect their children, they do it. And so they have a pretty thriving business, these guys on bicycles with UV lamps. And they actually were connected up to us through a social venture capital firm, one that invests in companies in the developing world. So we think a commercialization strategy that transfers this to the developing world and sits there has to happen. And that's our approach to exactly what you said, because you're right, I have no idea how this is going to get used. The best I can do is try to get it there and try to troubleshoot what they have, but they are going to have to decide if they want it, they may not want it, and how best to use it. And that's a really different model than, hey, the Western company built it and now we're going to sell it to you, or we're going to give it away.
Like the machines will light their down.
Or they try to give it away, which also turns out to fail because there's no incentive to maintain it and keep it sustainable. So it actually does have to be a local business. And so I think that that's our hope. And it's extremely difficult. So we're just giving it away and trying our best to transfer it early. But that's a good one.
I think we better stop questions here. If you have more questions, come on down and ask Vicky, but let's thank her again for giving an excellent talk.